Horatio. This has a bit of a story, and the story begins that when I first came to New Zealand and I reread Hamlet for, I'm not sure exactly how many times, I came across a passage in the play that indicated to me that maybe there was something quite important, even quite profound, about the role of Horatio in the play. And this follows from my background as a psychoanalyst and as someone who's looking for unconscious clues and things, and there's a long tradition of this, of course, which I won't have to describe to the general audience, except that this particular passage seemed to open up an entirely new dimension of Horatio. The other aspect of Hamlet the play, too, is that, as someone familiar with the play, Horatio had always seemed to come across as a character who had very little import. He just seemed to hang around Hamlet. He was Hamlet's friend. He was a student at Wittenberg with Hamlet, and he kind of showed up in various parts of the play, and of course at the very end he's going to report Hamlet's cause, a right to the unsatisfied. Coming across this particular passage, which I will quote exactly in a few minutes, led me to question other aspects of Horatio, and this led to for me, a particularly different and I think much more profound understanding of the play. So to backtrack a little bit, the traditional view about Horatio is, and I'll quote this from one of the standard Hamlet texts, is as follows, and this refers to this particular quotation. Quote, "It is a waste of time to try to fit Horatio's various references, not only to the old Hamlet but also to Denmark, into a coherent whole. No audience is likely to notice that once, the word which I'll get back to, is inconsistent with what Horatio has already said about the old king, or that his ignorance of Danish customs is incompatible with the knowledge of Danish history he shows. Horatio is essentially a piece of the dramatic mechanism, a Johannes factotum who will say or do whatever the plot requires of him, even to the extent of appearing from nowhere at a call from Hamlet," and that's with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. "What remains constant in him is his fidelity to the prince." I think this about sums up the general scholarly and public acceptance of the role of Horatio. He's sort of a factotum, somebody who moves the plot along, who does certain things because the plot supposedly requires it, and then sends us off with this promise to report Hamlet and his cause aright. Well, if we consider that, let's consider for a moment that Shakespeare is a pretty smart guy, okay? Whoever Shakespeare was, whoever wrote the plays. And let's say that given that his genius has been touted by so many people, perhaps there may be a little bit more to a character who plays, who shows up at such interesting times in the play and has this constant presence in the play. So that really is what I'm trying to get across as we talk about the role of Horatio today. But to do that, I have to provide an even further background. Hamlet the play is, if nothing, a play about deception, a play about appearances, hypocrisy, about things and people never being quite what they seem. And I can take every single character in this play and I can show that, with the exception of Horatio, if I take the conventional view of Horatio. But virtually everybody in this play is not exactly what he or she seems. Hamlet, is he mad? Is he not mad? Is he a great lover of Ophelia, or is he a cad? Polonius, is he a wonderful father? He spies on his own son. Is he a loving father to his daughter? He sets his daughter up with Hamlet in the court. Is he? I mean, these go through every single character. Claudius, of course, being the great example because he's given himself out as a great, popular, wonderful king, and in fact, he's killed his brother. Maybe they're not incompatible either in those ways. So there's Gertrude. Is she the faithful, wonderfully faithful wife whose memory of her dearest husband will live forever in her bosom and who would never conceive of marrying again? Well, she's not, obviously, because she does remarry. So everything about Hamlet is about betrayal, deception, hypocrisy, things never seeming quite to be what they are. And perhaps most pivotally, pardon me, is the ghost. Now, there are problems with the ghost. For one, this is one of the great plays in the history of the world literature, and it's essentially a kind of a ghost story. It begins with a ghost. We may accept that, and we may say, okay, this is a dramatic convention. This came out of the heritage of various plays and whatnot. However, the very veracity of the ghost itself is questioned by none other than Hamlet himself. For one thing, there's a debate about whether the ghost is this the ghost of King Hamlet, the old King Hamlet, or is it a demon? Is it a good ghost, as it were, or a bad ghost? And then Hamlet has a very, very significant slip in the play. Okay? In the most famous soliloquy in all of drama, and it's to be or not to be soliloquy, he says, who would fardels bear to groan and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourn no traveler returns, puzzles the will and therefore, etc. The undiscovered country from whose bourn no traveler returns. And yet, the play begins with someone who has returned from that undiscovered country, the ghost. So this slip of Hamlet's indicates that he himself continues in his own psyche to question the veracity of the ghost itself. Is this really a denizen from this undiscovered country or not? That's very, very critical. All right? So that begins to set this whole thing up. The other aspect about the ghosts I've mentioned before in other areas is that people see, Horatio, Marcellus, others see the ghost. No one hears the ghost. No one, the ghost speaks to no one but Hamlet. Hamlet is the one who hears the ghost. When Hamlet's with Gertrude, Hamlet hears the ghost. Gertrude doesn't hear the ghost, okay, or see the ghost at that point either. At the beginning, Horatio and the guards and whatever, and Marcellus see the ghost. They don't hear the ghost. Hamlet hears the ghost. When the ghost says, swear, swear, it's Hamlet who hears and not the others. That's a very, very interesting. So there's a lot of mystery about who is this ghost? What is this ghost? Is it a ghost? Is it a fiction, or is it something else? So let's take that aspect of things, and then let's go to some of the very interesting aspects of Horatio. Horatio is a friend of Hamlet from Wittenberg, correct? We don't know how old he is, and judging from what he says some things that are very, very interesting. For example, when he talks about the ghost itself, he says, Marcellus asks him, "Is it not like the king?" And Horatio says, "As thou art to thyself. Such was the very armor he had on when he, the ambitious Norway, combated. So frowned he once when in angry parley he smote the slitted pollocks on the ice. 'Tis strange." Well, if he's so familiar with the armor that King Hamlet had on when he had this duel with Fortinbras, then we know that's the time when Hamlet himself was born, the Prince Hamlet was born. So Horatio must be, who knows, 15, 20, who knows what he is? How does he know this? It's interesting. Now, if we accept and we just say, oh, this is just Shakespeare putting somebody in to make sure, then we can gloss over it. But if we pull ourselves up and say, that's an interesting thing to hear that, okay? That's something doesn't jibe. And then later, and this is the kicker, this is the slip that led me to this discovery. He says to Hamlet in Act 1, Scene 2, in fact, Hamlet is saying, Horatio says to Hamlet, Hamlet says, "My father, methinks I see my father." And Horatio says, "Well, where, my lord?" And Hamlet says, "In my mind's eye, Horatio." And Horatio says, "I saw him once. He was a goodly king." I saw him once. Now this makes no sense whatsoever if he's describing the armor that he had on and is smiting the slitted pollocks on the ice and everything else. This, to me, is an indication that maybe Horatio, the one character we think is straight and true and honest and whatnot, that he himself, like all the others, is not exactly what he seems. And then it leads us to start questioning things. These are very fascinating things. The timing of Horatio's visit just so happens to coincide with the appearance of the ghost. He says he's come to see the funeral and whatnot, and he's missed it. But he's come just at the time when the ghost is starting to create these troubles, and Denmark is preparing for war against Fortinbras, who's got his lawless resolutes, running around the place. That's interesting. Horatio also happens to appear in a number of very significant scenes, including not just the scene with Ulrich and Osrick's invitation to the duel, Osrick being a messenger of death. Another example of someone who, again, as a pleasant courtier, isn't exactly what he appears to be. He's setting Hamlet up for a duel to the death. In fact, the sword fight itself is supposed to be a friendly wager. In fact, it's a deadly duel. Again, nothing in Hamlet is exactly what it seems. So Horatio arrives just at the right time, just coincidentally, when the ghost makes his appearance and there's trouble in the state of Denmark. Okay? Horatio is also present at Ophelia's mad scene, and he describes Ophelia, and he's a friend of Gertrude and Claudius. He's embraced by Gertrude and Claudius as well, not just Hamlet. So Horatio has significant presence throughout the play, makes important appearances at very interesting times in the play, and happens also to be one of the few people who survive the carnage, which is Hamlet. When you think of the end of Hamlet, who are the survivors? Claudius is dead, Gertrude is dead, Laertes is dead, Polonius is dead, Ophelia is dead, okay? But you basically have left standing Fortinbras and Horatio. And as any good lawyer will tell you, when they're looking for a motive for a crime, they'll say, cui bono? Who's benefited from this action? So that, I believe, is the gist of this idea that, in fact, if we look very closely at everything that Horatio does and says in his presence, that he may be perhaps the most perfidious, the most subtle, the most malicious villain in all of Shakespeare. And if that's the case, it fits completely into the play itself. Hamlet is all about this. It fits so perfectly, and it's as if Shakespeare has been having us on all these centuries, and we go along with this idea that he's an incidental character who has this little nice role as Hamlet's good buddy and all that, and in fact, he may be much more. So that really is the gist of what I'm trying to get across. And so if you accept, just at the very least, accept that Horatio may in fact be a very strong, powerful presence in the play, then you won't do things like cut out some magnificent lines of Horatio, as I saw in a recent production, where Horatio was so trivialized that they cut out the following lines. It's very famous, when Hamlet is, when the ghost appears, and Horatio is apparently attempting to keep Hamlet from going to the ghost, and he says, "What if it tempt you toward the flood, my lord, or to the dreadful summit of the cliff that beetles o'er his base into the sea, and there assume some other horrible form which might deprive your sovereignty of reason and draw you into madness." Think of it. Now, to hear that passage cut was really very surprising, but then that goes along with this idea of a conventional, lightweight kind of Horatio. To look at that passage with the idea that maybe Horatio is as much more than he seems, then allows you to think, well, this is almost an incantatory passage in its own right. This is almost leading Hamlet into madness, as it were, to talk about this precipice, this dreadful summit. And in fact, that's exactly what happens in the play. Hamlet steps across this precipice, and there's carnage throughout the entire play. So if you were to ask me, well, how will this idea affect performance at all? I would say, there are several reactions. First is, you may need to do nothing else except present a Horatio who is a solid, strong, interesting character. And then you let the unconscious message seep through to us. Okay? And we don't have to, hit you over the head and turn him into an obvious villain. Let the unconscious aspect of it communicate itself. And I'll talk about this with respect to the manifest play and an author's intentions and what we really get from a play. Okay? The other way you could make this even fuller is to be a bit more have Horatio be a bit more ambiguous and slightly sinister in the interactions he has with Hamlet, so that when he's trying to prevent Hamlet from rushing off to talk to the ghost, you may make his attempts to hold Hamlet back less forceful. He may just make a token effort, in fact, because he wants Hamlet to sort of get sucked into this whole drama. So the other way to do it too, if you want to make something of this, is to create a whole other drama or a story about Horatio himself and give a backstory. Now, in my novella, when I first made this observation, I was on the verge of writing a paper, a psychoanalytic paper for a journal, which would espouse my theory about the role of Horatio. And then I decided, well, who's going to listen to me making this particular observation, and why don't I do something a little more fun and maybe with a little more heft, and have Sherlock Holmes make this observation, and then the word will get out and whatever. So I happen to like Conan Doyle a great deal, and I've read a lot of Sherlock Holmes. So I ended up writing a Sherlock Holmes novella, and which was published in 2008, which espouses theory. And I created a backstory, and the backstory, accepting that Horatio is not all that he seems, is that perhaps there is a connection between Horatio and Fortinbras and the takeover of the state of Denmark. But that's a little fancy. I think it's quite viable and it's quite plausible. But the central element, I think, from what I'm trying to say, is that there may be much more to Horatio than has hitherto been understood. And there are a lot of inconsistencies and ambiguities about Horatio that suggest such a thing. So, this then allows me to get into a discussion about how people view or experience a play and an author's, playwright's intentions. This is very important. Very often you'll hear in Shakespeare scholarship and in discussions of any literary work, well, what did the author really mean? What did the author want you to think? What did the author want you to get from this? What did the author do this, that? And I think actually that's barking up the wrong tree. The author may or may not have wanted you to do 5 million things or feel 5 million ways. But when a creation occurs like that, because the unconscious is so much a part of any creator's work, there are going to be unconscious forces and themes that will escape or emerge despite the most punctilious, pedantic author's persnickety attention. Okay? And I think in this case, you may say, well, Shakespeare just wrote this and he had no idea that this Horatio was doing this, that, the other. But that part of the creative demon that moved him to write this play may have compelled him to create this character in this way to raise lots of questions in us about this very deep subtext, as it were. Or he may have been extremely clever. And I can imagine a Shakespeare chuckling to himself about this truly devious and wily and wonderful creation that would not even wouldn't even be perceived by anybody, except in some very profound and immense, deep way, unconsciously. So I think that basically sums up my aspect and my perspective on this particular topic. I frankly think it kind of gives us a sort of a revolutionary approach to Hamlet. It deepens something that's already been full of mystery and profound and unsettling and deep, and just adds to the richness of our experience of this tremendous play.
It doesn't alter the outcome of the play. It adds another lovely dimension of fabric. And it's very plausible. I can't imagine, after hearing you, that Shakespeare would write a play where one character was so bland as he was, and where everyone else is betraying someone, and you've got this person who was just this wonderful friend, which is, or he's always been portrayed as that, and a foil, and directs or helps with the direction of the play, and you've just added another dimension, which
in a way
he's really duplicitous, devious, and it's a wonderful sort of.
I think it's fascinating, and I mean he does in that way. He does stick out like a sore thumb this conventional lightweight goody that we are accustomed to seeing with Horatio. But as I said, in performance, even if you just give him more weight and give that character more presence, then that adds another dimension to the play, as opposed to a throwaway kind of, a tag along. Because if you think of these buddy films and buddy things like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, the so-called buddy of the hero is always usually just as cogent and wily and powerful as the hero himself or herself, or heroine, for example. So if you think of Horatio as and this is a bit of an association, as a Sancho Panza to Don Quixote here, that's still very important, because Sancho Panza was an extremely active and compelling figure in the great Cervantes
You made an
work.
interesting point too. His portrayal will depend on what lines are kept and what is cut.
That's right.
And in such a lengthy play, some of the really significant lines that support your theory are sometimes cut.
Some of them are cut altogether.
And what about his interpretation of Ophelia? The real psychological input and his understanding of that does not suggest he's a bland, ignorant
That's a
person.
very, very good point. I think that's a really lovely point you make there too. He's not. He's a very important character in this play, and he's been, I think, given short shrift by these kinds of ideas by commentators that he's just someone to move things along. He's a factotum. I think that's not correct. He's far too important. The other interesting thing about Horatio too in this is that virtually everything we know about Fortinbras comes through the mouth of Horatio. So it's another little thing to just make us think, well, is there a connection? There is a connection. Horatio arrives on the scene, the ghost is appearing, Fortinbras is on the outskirts, all these things are happening together. That suggests the simultaneity of appearances. It suggests there's a link between these things.
I think it's interesting that Shakespeare possibly hasn't defined him absolutely, but allowed these clues to come through. Would you not say?
I think
that allow us to think, imagine him, interpret him in various ways.
I think so, very much so.
Good or bad, sinister. In fact, in one portrayal, in one production, he could move from sinister to good to, and we're confused about him.
Yeah, and like many of the other characters in the play itself, we're not, as I say, he's very seldom is Shakespeare ever black and white about anybody. There are
someone
always
who
ambiguities.
writes the way Shakespeare did, and his poetry and wonderful utterances that are now in our language, he's not going to write innocently about Horatio.
Well, even if he does, and that's an important thing. Even if he is innocent, or his intentions are not to make this particular character into this great villain, dramatic, we're still left with the impact of what emerged from the playwright's creative demon, basically, and that really is it.
It's Campbell, right?
Yeah. Middle body, it's sweet. I could throw it off this building.
Just thought I'd ask. Yeah.
So did you have any questions about?
Yeah. So I've got sort of two key things which sort of hold me back from completely accepting the theory. Yeah. And the first one is obviously that the ghost appears when Hamlet and Gertrude obviously people don't always show that, but in the stage directions it does say that the ghost appears in a nightgown, and but then we end up with this question that Gertrude isn't implied to have seen the ghost. So is the idea that Horatio has implanted the seed in Hamlet's mind, and that Hamlet has gone mad somewhere in the second or third act, and that this is essentially him seeing the ghost because he's already seen it before? So,
yeah, well, that's a very sophisticated issue, and that gets back to this. First of all, stage directions. We're not sure where the stage directions came from, and whether they came from what we consider the original manuscript, which doesn't exist, and or whether we're planted there in the first folio or the second quarto. But the idea, I think the important thing is that Gertrude does not see the ghost. She does not hear the ghost. The ghost there, when Hamlet is with Gertrude, I think is most plausibly explained as a projection of his own inner conflict, that he is, if not crazy, mad crazy, he is consumed by this conflict and by this sense of guilt that he has to get retribution for his father or whatever. I think that's the only way to explain it psychologically, that this is a reflection of Hamlet's inner mind, externalized. Okay. Otherwise, if it's a ghost, it's a ghost that only appears to one person. You can hear one person.
But he does appear to the other ones, and it's only Gertrude who's unable to see him, which does suggest something. Again, leaves the question open. The other one is that Hamlet is an exceedingly astute judge of character in the play. So, particularly, he sniffs out Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He sniffs out anyone essentially who is threatening him and his plans. So it begs me to wonder why he doesn't suspect Horatio. I mean, we don't get an Othello-sized level of the interplay going on between them. So it's obviously difficult to tell.
Well, I think that hits it. I mean, if there's a truth to this idea, then that's the greatest irony. Here's Horatio. Remember, he says to Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And he talks about how honest Horatio is, as good and just a man withal as one could find. And wouldn't it be the most damning, profound, blackest irony if the person that Hamlet has no doubts about whatsoever betrays him? I mean, Ophelia betrays him in a certain way. She's there setting him up while her father and Claudius behind the arras, and she lies. But
I feel like it's very much implied that Hamlet knows that he's being set up pretty much the entire time, particularly through that passage of the play. And particularly in Burton's production, you see that he suddenly realizes that Polonius and Claudius are watching him, and it does feel like Hamlet has been reading everyone through this play, constantly commenting on them and essentially being able to read their motivations. So you're right.
Maybe he just has a lot of hubris to him. I mean, sure, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but those aren't exactly the most intelligent characters in the play. They're pretty obvious the whole time.
And he uses his madness to mock Polonius quite a bit. Yeah.
Well, the dimensions of Hamlet are so many, and they're you can play that scene in the Arras, where Ophelia, he has his soliloquy to be or not to be, and Ophelia comes in and wants to give him gifts and whatnot. You can play it straight, which is that he doesn't really know that they're actually watching behind him, because he says, "Where's your father?" He says he's home, and you can play that completely sincere, or you can play it with his thinking, "I know that you're lying to me," and this again, but this gets into the mystery of how much does he love Ophelia and feel undone by her, how much does she love Hamlet, feel undone by him. It adds to the mix. And so, and is Hamlet such an astute judge of character? Well, he's really aware that there's something going on. Okay, and Claudius, he's been told Claudius has killed his father. He's not sure he really believes it until, at a certain point, but he sets up a whole play to divine that truth, right? If he reacts this way, I know the ghost is telling me the truth. The mousetrap. Okay, so he's himself questioning this. Is it true? Is it not true? And all that. And he's aware of everything falling apart around him, and aware of these, and aware of these machinations. That's true.
So, do you think, in your more complex version of Horatio, do you think he knew Claudius was behind the murder of the original Hamlet? The late King Hamlet? Or do you think maybe Horatio just thought, who else could it have been, and went that way, or maybe it was just a plan to drive Hamlet mad.
Well, I think you can. Again, I think that leaves a lot of things open. I think it could be a plan. If you were to accept a more elaborate theory and say that he and Fortinbras cooked something up, and the idea was just to get to plunge the court of Denmark into a bit more turmoil, to soften them up for the blow, and Fortinbras is skirting around doing all this stuff, etc. Then you can say, well, it's sufficient just to sort of stir the pot, right? On the other hand, one wonders again. The king dies in the garden. Were there any suspicions? Now, anytime a king dies, an important person dies, in a political environment, there are suspicions. Okay? The fact that that important person's brother ended up marrying his wife would undoubtedly have raised suspicions, not just in Hamlet, but in other people as well. People talk, right? Who benefits? Well, Claudius. King Hamlet dies, Claudius gets the kingdom, gets the wife, and whatever, etc. So in this more elaborate idea, it's quite possible that there were suppositions that Claudius may have been behind this, and that maybe that would be a good time to unsettle the court and then to kind of engineer kind of a strike, as it were. But even then, I think I get back to this idea, that would be a good story in itself, and that would be a wonderful kind of play or a book, but the more elaborate version doesn't have to exist as long as we focus on the possibility of this enigmatic Horatio, who himself might be this tremendous deceiver. I think that, to me, is more the crux in this idea. But you can go to town on it and other aspects of it.
Would you mind, because a lot of people who watch this video might not have read your book, would you mind explaining your more elaborate theory a bit, just so we have it?
Yeah, well, the more elaborate theory is really is to consider that Horatio is a great betrayer, and that Horatio and Fortinbras were in league to foment a rebellion within the court of Denmark, so that Fortinbras could then get revenge for his father's death at the hands of old King Hamlet and claim the territory of Denmark. And it looks at these various points. Fortinbras and Horatio are there at the end cleaning up, as it were, the only people left standing. Horatio may have been what we would call in more modern parlance a mole, as it were.
Actually, it makes the end, where everyone is lying dead and it tends to be slightly farcical, more understandable.
It also makes sense because Hamlet is very beloved by the people. It's mentioned many times in the play that the people like Hamlet more than they like Claudius. So for him to prophesy his election rights onto Fortinbras gives Fortinbras a much clearer command of the people for when he comes into rule, if that was indeed the theory. Which is, I gotta say, it's growing on me.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
But we don't need to accept it in total.
No, I think that theory...
I think it's part, as I said before, of the fabric of the play.
Yeah.
I think I had some other questions, but they've gone now.
If you were to direct it again, could you be tempted to move towards that, portraying that theory?
Yeah, I think if I were to direct Hamlet again, what I would do is I would make the ambiguities of Horatio stronger. I'd add some subtle, sinister elements in Horatio's portrayal. I did want a strong Horatio when we did this recent Hamlet, and I think and Laertes did a great job on that. It was a very, very full character, but I think I would go a step further if I were to do it again, just to see how that might affect the actual fabric of the scenario.
And how would you do it? Sort of with asides, or?
Yeah, I think you would do it. You can do this with just nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
They would be very subtle gestures. They would have Horatio with a particular kind of intensity, a very strong Horatio, and possibly with a slightly more malleable Hamlet. I mean, there are ways you can kind of make the balance change a little bit. Okay? I'd have to think about it a bit more, but I think I would do it not in any grossly overt ways. Now, one overt way you could do it is to say you could have the ghost clearly being a fiction paraded around. Let's say, like if you can imagine that this ghostly figure was an actor, maybe one of the actors that had been scrounging around for work, one of the players in the mousetrap even, whom they recruited and said, listen, get dressed up as the king, and all you do is walk along the ramparts and so many feet away and look and turn. I mean, that may be one way that could have been actually set up, and you can actually do that for an audience to raise really more serious questions about the ghost and to show the ghost as being really an absolute setup by someone else. So that would be one way to do it.
This is almost a psychological drama as well, because we tend to gloss over the characters and think about the events that have impacted on them, like the death of the king, Hamlet's father, and his mother remarrying and all of that. When you really think about it, they're very impacting things, and some of them are enough to drive Hamlet into a state of madness, which was was foretold by Horatio.
Yeah, the whole drama is full of these psychological potencies.
Potency is a good word.
Yeah.
Would you like to hear a little bit more about the unconscious interpretation, and because it's obviously it's not something I'm particularly fond of, but I tend to think in very arts intensive kind of ways, just simply because I write and I wouldn't want to be in a situation where people are reading things into my work that
Well, that would be good.
Yeah. So,
yeah, it's good.
You can't. That's right. They can't help but read things in your work, and you can't help but that they do it.
Yeah.
That's good, actually.
Yeah, it's just,
yeah, it's good to have some interesting discussion like this. But what if it's more negative things about your work?
And today a lot of semantic issues revolve around gender and sexuality, and people will read things that you had no intention of saying, or they read contextual lines out of context, which is very frustrating. But that's not really the question. The question is more to do with, how do you perceive an unconscious sort of interpretation of the...
Okay, well, that's a very basic, that's a very important question, and I think that's the answer. There's an infinity we can discuss about that, and this gets back to really gets back to dream interpretation, to Freud's ideas about dream interpretation, and let me summarize them very briefly. You have a dream at night, okay, and the dream says, let's say I'm making up a dream. I'm going to the post office and I'm depositing a yellow letter in a red mailbox. And that's the dream. Okay? So, pretty much until Freud came along, the idea was that, this was the dream. What he ended up really discovering is that so-called manifest content, the remembered dream, he called the manifest content, was something on the very surface, and that what that dream really was about, if you were to delve into the latent content, the unseen content, the below the surface, which he did via free association to various elements of the dream and feelings, you may get a completely different picture, much richer. That dream could be about, that dream of going to deposit a letter into the mailbox could be about something involving a brother or a sister or your parents or who knows what unconscious fantasies. And so that's, again, in this venue, it's hard to do, for me to sort of outline a tremendous whole field. But I would say that in looking at a work of art, any work of art, a novel, a theatrical piece, anything, that we see the unfolding scene or scenario or the story or whatever, but that's really just a bit of it. That below that surface of what we apprehend are probably infinite possibilities of interpretation, maybe within certain parameters, but that give rise to all kinds of understanding. So that there, when we talk about interpreting a play in a certain way, that's one way that we're saying, we feel something else that's going on besides, this particular surface, and we're going to kind of push that element of it. So I think that anything like that is going to leave itself to many interpretations. And again, I'll get back to, and I'll say this very strongly, the most punctilious, directive author is not going to be able to control what a reader or a spectator or a thinker gets out of what he or she has written or done. Okay? And there's no way to get around that.
Did you get that?
Yeah.
That's very important. Yeah. So I as a writer, I write poems, I write stories and all that.
Yeah.
And then, I'm sure that I just in a recent example, someone pointed out something in a book that I wrote recently, and I thought to myself, gosh, I wasn't even aware of that. And it made perfect sense. This other kind of parallel that was going on. And it's there. It's out there. And you have to live with that.
Yeah, the dream stuff is very useful actually, because that's going to feed in. Because not all of us are aware of Freudian dream interpretation.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So it's a magnificent. It's one of the great discoveries about again how what you see on the surface is the proverbial tip of the iceberg.
It's very important for explaining your theory as well, is to actually have something to explain to a lay audience.
Yeah,
psychoanalysis is a difficult field to
Yeah, well, psychoanalysis, very few people know anything about it. Yeah. It's actually, I've come over the years to think that the name itself is really a very poor name. Psychoanalysis is it's too mechanistic. It's too devoid of feeling, even in the name of it. It doesn't really say what it really does. I think it's much better to think about these ideas that most of what we perceive and feel is outside of our awareness. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it's really true. Okay, the vast majority of what we feel and see and hear and all that is really unconscious. We have a huge unconscious life, and I don't know how else to explain it except that there's evidence all over the place about those kinds of things. And the evidence comes in little things like slips of the tongue, slips, that I've talked about in this particular play.
Right. I think that's a pretty good ending somewhere there, actually.
Yeah, I think.
Anyone got any more questions?
I'm done.
No, I don't have anything.
So it wasn't a real ghost in the play. The ghost, it's not a real ghost. Because my entire experience of this is filming the play the other week, and I'm just like, if the ghost was real, why wasn't it more important to the plot? Because surely they're like, holy crap, there's a ghost over there.
It's a very good question. Actually, my recent production, and I thought this was really good. I had the ghost voice, so you didn't see an actual, little like someone with a white sheet on a stick running around. You heard the ghost voice, and people responded as if they were seeing this thing. And I think that was really a very, very powerful way of presenting that. But that does get back to this very important question: is this? Do they believe in this ghost?
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
Well, they might have believed in them in those days.
Yeah.
But I like your story where he co-opted the players. I mean, that's believable.
It's plausible. So you can actually spin this elaborate thing and make it quite plausible.
So Shakespeare wrote the Midsummer Night's Dream, which involves fairies and Prospero and magic. It plays a role in the play. So it's not as the characters in Shakespeare's world are uncomfortable with the idea of ghosts or the supernatural. Particularly, Hamlet has an entire line which suggests, I'm very open to the supernatural. There's more. It's very famous.
I liked your idea where it's a player at the beginning, and then as the play progresses, Hamlet has fallen into that state of madness, and that he's possibly hallucinating, or it's how you explained it, that projection of.
Do on stage though.
It's a hard thing to stage, but and the Ghost of King Hamlet, he's a very interesting ghost, the most peculiar ghost. I'll say this.
The ghost changed its character as the play went on. Did it not? A bit. And
actually, there have been books written about the effect of of Hamlet's father on Hamlet, and the kind of the Oedipal burden placed upon the son to exact revenge for the father. There's a lot of stuff that's been
I think he was under that much pressure. It's not surprising he crumbled.
Yeah. So, okay.
Cool.
I love that, Chris. I love your question.